Hey guys, and welcome to the second half of our lecture series on ancient Indian empires. Today we'll be talking mostly about the Gupta Empire. Here are your key concepts, and I know I sound like a broken record, but please do not forget about the Conrad-Demarest model. It's especially important here because the Gupta Empire is one that's very commonly compared to the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty in China. Take a few more moments to read over these key concepts. Here's your key vocab. We didn't talk about guilds so much last time, but we will bring that up this time. And these two terms, Dao and Latin sale, are connected. We'll talk about those near the end. Okay, so before we can talk about how the Gupta Empire starts and what it does, we have to talk about how and why the Mauryan Empire ends. Now, this was in your last section of reading of Spodek, but we're going to go ahead and review it here. You should remember from the reading, especially if you did the guided notes, that there was kind of a weakness of leadership and that it also gets weakened by these outside invaders and eventually taken over by these outside invaders and fragmented. How would you categorize these two things according to the Conrad-Demarest model? How might you categorize these things according to Spodek's reasons for why empires are successful or why empires fail? Take a few moments to think about that. Alright, so let's talk about the Gupta Empire. Where did they come from? Well, their story is kind of like the story of the Mauryan Empire. Remember, the Mauryan Empire formed when one state called Magadha over here in the east wound up exercising its power and influence and dominance over a bunch of other smaller independent states and eventually formed an empire. And after the Mauryan Empire is broken up through foreign invasion, after hundreds of years of disunity, the Gupta come around and start to reunify it in much the same way. A smaller state in the north of the Indian subcontinent starts to exercise its dominance and spread its territory over other surrounding states until eventually you get this kind of mustard-colored dark area here, which was the area of direct Gupta control. What you see around it is the area of influence. So the Gupta Empire didn't have as much direct control as you see on this map, but it did use its political power, its military might, to extract wealth and resources under the threat of force from these areas. The Gupta political power and the way it got its resources isn't nearly as important as the mark that it left on India. It's only around kind of temporarily. I know 300 years seems like it's not very temporary, but in the grand scheme of things, it is. What's most important to remember about the Gupta Empire is the religious impact they left on India. Remember that under Ashoka, Buddhism had been the big thing. Buddhism was promoted under the Mauryan Empire near the end and really replaced Hinduism. And it might have stayed that way. And India might be majority Buddhist today if not for what the Gupta Empire did. Just like Ashoka under the Mauryan Empire sponsored Buddhist monks and missionaries and funded their work to spread the religion, the Gupta Empire's leaders did the exact opposite. They defunded Buddhist missionaries and Buddhist monks, and they instead chose to give their resources to Hindu priests, the Brahmin class or caste. And as a result, those folks were able to spread their ideas, and Hinduism really re-emerged in India, and it's stuck there today. So before we go on, if we're talking about state-sponsored religion, anytime where a political power gets involved in pushing any kind of religion, what themes are interacting here? Well, the state part, the politics part, that's got to be theme 3, right? And religion, as you guys should know by now, big part of theme 2. Alright, so let's do some comparative empire study here, because the AP exam loves to ask about these 3. The Gupta Empire in India, the Roman Empire obviously in the Mediterranean, and the Han Empire, Han Dynasty in China. You'll almost certainly see a question that asks you to compare those 3 empires, whether it's an FRQ or more likely one or a set of multiple choice questions. So I could talk pretty much all day about similarities and differences between these 3, but hopefully you guys already have a pretty good idea of what those look like by using your Conrad Demarest model. You could also use a sprite chart to compare them. I want to highlight though one major difference between Indian empires and the other 2 you've been asked to compare. In the Indian Empire situation, you normally see social rules coming from the people, coming from society as a whole, influencing how the government is run, what sort of laws the government is going to enforce. On the other hand, with Roman and Chinese empires, you tend to see the folks at the top in power of the government or in charge of the government influencing the social rules. One example of that would be how the economic system was run in these various empires. For instance, in the Indian empires, guilds, which were these groups of merchants that were tied to a particular trade, they would set their own prices, set their own rules and regulations for how they were going to do business. And all they asked was that the government of their empire regulate and enforce the rules that the guilds themselves had already come up with. On the other hand, in China, for example, most of those economic rules and regulations weren't set by the people themselves. They were set by the government, and they were enforced from the top down. So whereas in India, the guilds would say, we're going to make this much of this product, this is the quality that it's got to be, government please enforce that. In China, the government would say, okay, you guys need to make this much silk, and we're going to export it for this price, and you're going to pay us, as your government, a percentage of your earnings to cover the taxes that we need. So 2 very different directions of influence in these 3 empires. Okay, so this is the part for me where world history starts to get really exciting, because the AP exam and world historians in general really aren't that interested in studying individual cultures in isolation. They like to talk about cultural interactions. And it's at this point in the material that we really start to talk about cultural interactions. But before I get too ahead of myself, I want to show you guys some documents. And these are not text-based documents, as you can see, but image-based documents. And you will see questions like this on your AP exam, either in the DBQ, or you might even see images like this pop up in the multiple choice section. The AP loves to address this sort of thing. So I'm going to show you these 2 documents here. One is a sculpture called the Gandhara Buddha, made in India about 100 CE. Another one is a Greek-style sculpture made in Rome about 100 BCE. All right. Before I get too in-depth talking about these things, I just want you guys to take a minute on your own and think to yourself, what do I notice about these two images? Compare these two images. What are some things you can see about them, either similarities, differences, or otherwise? Just take a moment to notice some of the style you see in the artwork here. I'll be back with you shortly. Okay, so what are some of the things that you saw in terms of the style of the artwork? Did you guys notice the style of the carving for the hair here? Kind of similar, right? These two figures are wearing a different hairstyle, but the way in which the hair is actually carved into the stone looks kind of similar, right? Anything else you guys noticed? How about the eyes, right? Similar style of carving there for the eyes. And also, other than that, very smooth features as well. Obviously, the figures look different, right? One is male, one is female, etc., but the way that they're carved, I hope you noticed, looks pretty similar, okay? So that's the basics about these two documents, but a bigger question is, what can you really learn from the similarities in these two images, combined with the fact that you know one is from India about this time, one is from Rome about 200 years earlier? What can you tell based on that information? Take about 2 minutes and see what you guys come up with. Alright, that question that I just left you with, what can you learn from these two documents and the source information that describes them? That's the kind of question you might see on the AP exam. The AP folks eat this sort of thing up, okay? And hopefully you were thinking along the lines of cultural diffusion. It's not a coincidence that the style of carving here from India and Rome looks so similar, all right? They're both a Greek style of artwork, and this should tell you that Greek culture reached as far east as India and as far west as Rome. You guys probably knew that it got to Rome, but you might not have known that Alexander the Great, who we read about in chapter 5, took it all the way as far east as the Indus River, which is the region where Gandhara Buddha was made. Okay, so that's important for you guys to be able to realize. That's high-level AP thinking. Okay, and like I said, it's called cultural diffusion, when one aspect of a certain culture travels to another and impacts the other. So why should we care about cultural diffusion? Well, besides the fact that cultural diffusion is just awesome for its own sake, it really does have a lasting impact on the lives of people around the planet today. Take this example. You have over here a image of an ancient Greek wearing his traditional style of clothing, the toga, right? Most of you guys are familiar with that. Take a look over here at this man from Southeast Asia and what he's wearing. Compare these two styles. This clothing, if you look at these two images, is almost exactly identical, right? In the way it's draped over the shoulder, in the way it's being worn. The color might be different, but there are far more similarities than there are differences. And guys, this is not a coincidence. This is cultural diffusion at work. This is the remnants of Greek culture extending as far east as Southeast Asia. And that's just really cool, because it still affects and impacts the lives of folks who live there today. Thousands of miles away from Greece, thousands of years after these garments were popular in Greece. So cultural diffusion is something that can impact places and times very far removed from where those cultures began. That's one of the reasons it's pretty awesome and still has a lasting impact. And this culture has found its way to the West as well. Obviously, I'm being a little bit silly with this image. If you're familiar with the movie Animal House, you've probably heard of toga parties. Heck, the seniors during homecoming week still sometimes wear togas, and that's our cultural adaptation of Greek culture, which might not be as serious as this guy's, but it's still our own culture putting a spin, our own spin, on something we've adapted from somewhere else. So that's the other cool thing about cultural diffusion. The image over here on the left, the culture on the left, inspires both of the images on the right. But one, you can see, has a very different outcome in terms of its final form after cultural diffusion than the other does, right? And that's a product of the same culture interacting with two very different cultures in different places and in different times. That's why cultural diffusion, I think, is really awesome, because of the blend of cultures, and also why it impacts our lives today. It's part of our pop culture even in some cases, and it's part of religious culture in other cases. But it goes even further than that. This is just one example. Okay, so how does Greek culture get all the way from here to here? Well, it's through trade, right? As we've talked about so many times, when we trade goods, we not only trade those goods, but we also trade ideas, right? We also trade our cultures. And that's why this is probably one of the top 10 most important slides that we're going to see this year. It's about Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade. And I know there's not a whole lot of text on this slide, but that doesn't mean it's not important, because I'll be talking a lot here, and a lot of the things I'm going to say you're going to want to remember. And I do apologize in advance if I start rambling, but this topic just gets me so excited, and same thing for almost anyone who considers himself a true world historian, because, like I said, this is what we're interested in. Not just cultures existing by themselves, but cultures impacting each other. And it's this time period in history that we're talking about right now, where that interaction of cultures really starts to take hold, at least in the Eastern Hemisphere. You'll notice we haven't talked about the Western Hemisphere too much, because the same level of cultural interaction really isn't happening over there at this time. But boy, there is so much more interaction going on in the East at this time than there was in any other time period before it. So it's really important stuff. I'm going to talk about these trade lanes and routes in more depth here, and it's not a coincidence where those trade routes ran and why they ran through those areas. Let's talk about some of the reasons that trade was allowed to happen, and some of the reasons that folks wanted trade to happen. The first thing you need to be aware of is that technology allowed for trade. These are two of those vocab words I talked about earlier that I said that they were going to be connected. They are quite literally connected right here in this picture. The dhow is the type of ship, and the lateen sail is the type of sail there, that triangular shaped sail. All right, ships like this were very common in the Indian Ocean during this time. It was a technology that really allowed for trade and therefore cultural diffusion. Why this technology? Why this place? Why this time? Well, in talking about that, we really have to talk about theme one: humans' interaction with their environment. And this over here is the environment of the Indian Ocean. You're going to see more about this when I post some John Green lectures to Edmodo in the future. But what you see in these maps here are descriptions of what's called monsoon winds. Okay, and in the summer, winds tend to blow from the southwest to the northeast. Okay, and in the winter, they tend to blow in the opposite direction, from the northeast to the southwest. Now, I know that sounds really boring, and I know I'm playing weatherman here for a second, but why the heck is the weather so important as far as trade? Well, these seasons are really, really predictable. So, if you are a merchant who's sailing along the Indian Ocean, you have a really good idea of when you can leave from one end of this trade route to the other, or vice versa, and how long it's going to take you to get there, especially if you've got technology like this on your side. What's the connection between these winds over here and the technology? Well, a lot of times you might have wanted to go northeast, or you might have wanted to go southwest, but maybe you wanted to go northwest, or maybe you wanted to go southeast, perhaps along the Indian Ocean. The cool thing about this triangular sail is that it allows you to sail even if you're not going with the wind at your back. So even if you're not going in the summer from over here on the southeastern coast of Africa to the western coast of India, you could go due north, even if the wind wasn't directly at your back. I don't know exactly how that works. I'm not sure what the physics is behind it. Maybe you could ask your physics teacher. All I know is that it does work. So these triangular sails, coupled with these predictable winds, meant that you could go almost anywhere you wanted to within the Indian Ocean during any given year. And that's important because that predictability allows for trade. The other thing, besides the environment and besides the technology that allowed for trade, is the stability of empires. All right, you've got long periods of lasting empires in India with the Mauryan and the Gupta. You've got long periods of lasting dynasties in China with the Han, and then later on the Sui and the Tang together. You've got for a long time a very strong Roman Empire in the Mediterranean, and there's some time periods where all three of these empires overlap. So when you've got stability, you've usually got relative peace and security. And peace and security is also very good for business. You don't want to be attacked by bandits if you're trading along the Silk Road here. You don't want to be attacked by pirates on the ocean. And the stronger your empire's political situation is, the safer your travelers probably will be, and the more trade is going to happen. So you've got culture from Rome interacting indirectly with culture from the Indian empires, interacting indirectly with culture from China, and all these other smaller territories that we don't have time to mention, but they had relatively long-lasting and strong political situations there as well. The trade also helped their economies and helped to strengthen and maintain those political systems, because most of the wealth from the trade was controlled obviously by the higher social classes, the folks who were higher up. Okay, that's just the trade itself, though. What about the cultural diffusion, right? You should have read a bit about Buddhism and how it starts to spread out of India into China during Ashoka's time, but it also spread through the Indian Ocean to Southeast Asia. So you start to see Buddhist temples spring up in Southeast Asia. You also start to see, after Hinduism comes back in India, and even before Buddhism is established in India, you start to see Hinduism spread to Southeast Asia too. So there are, in fact, followers of Hinduism outside of India as well, if you guys didn't know, and it all has to do with Indian Ocean trade. Buddhism is eventually going to go all the way through China into Korea and to Japan, which we'll talk about a little bit later. There are even some stories about Buddhism perhaps making its way to the Middle East and interacting with and even influencing Christianity. We don't know how much truth there is to that story, but it is an interesting theory and it could have happened. All because of this stability that lent itself to interregional trade. The motivation was economic. Obviously, we want the goods, right? But even though we're trading for an economic reason, we're also influencing each other in a very strong cultural way. So I hope that my discussion on this slide was helpful to you guys. Not a whole lot of words here, but a lot of important ideas. And this isn't the last time we're going to deal with Indian Ocean trade either. It's going to come back up when we talk about Islam and the spread of Islam throughout the Indian Ocean. If you guys didn't know, there's linguistic blends between Arabic and Bantu languages in Southeast Africa. There's a whole lot of Islam in Indonesia today. Why is that? Well, it all has to do with Arabian merchants later on taking over Indian Ocean trade. We'll revisit this topic plenty of times because it is super, super important. All right, guaranteed there will be multiple questions about this on the AP exam, and there are oftentimes FRQs about changes and continuities in Indian Ocean trade as well. So I'm sorry for rambling at you guys there, but it's really, really important. Okay, your reward for listening to all of that is that this is our last slide. All right, it's about the end of the Gupta Empire. What happened to it? Well, Spodek will tell you there's a weakness of leadership. There was a military invasion which sparked some revolts from within. Ask yourself one more time as you're completing your Conrad Demarest chart, how well does it fit? Where do these things fit? And how well does this fit with Spodek's model? All right, that's it. Thanks for watching all that, guys. Remember that, I can't say this enough, this is the most important slide. Okay, so what happens to the Gupta is pretty important, but what happens during the Gupta in interregional trade is the most important. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you guys back in class.